On behalf of the New York Encounter, I am delighted to welcome you to this panel discussion entitled On Pilgrimage Towards Unity, the Life of Dorothy Day. My name is Paige Sanchez, and I work as the Associate Superintendent for Mission Effectiveness in the Catholic Schools Office of the Archdiocese of New York. And now we will begin, and I am pleased to introduce to you our speakers. First, we have Cardinal Timothy Michael Dolan. He was named Archbishop of New York by Pope Benedict XVI on February 23, 2009. He was installed as Archbishop of New York on April 15, 2009. He had served as Archbishop of Milwaukee since he was named by Pope John Paul II on June 25, 2002. Archbishop Dolan was ordained to the priesthood on June 19, 1976. In 1979, he began studies for a doctorate in American Church history at the Catholic University of America. In 1994, he was appointed rector of the Pontifical North American College in Rome, where he served until June 2001. The work of the Archbishop in the area of seminary education has influenced the life and ministry of a great number of priests of the new millennium. He is currently a member of the Board of Trustees of the Catholic University of America. He is also a member of the Pontifical Council for Promoting New Evangelization. Tom Cornell is the associate editor of The Catholic Worker. He is a deacon in the Catholic Church. He is retired and living at the Peter Morin Farm in Marlborough, New York. He is a co-founder of the Catholic Peace Fellowship and Pax Christi USA, a former member of the executive staff of Fellowship of Reconciliation and executive committee of Pax Christi USA, and the War Registers League and the Workers' Defense League. Welcome. Margaret Laracy is a clinical psychologist licensed in Maryland. She works with individuals, couples, and group at a practice in Frederick, Maryland. She has taught psychology at several graduate institutions. Dr. Laracy is among the curators of the exhibit at this year's New York Encounter called A Catholic Paradox, The Life and Works of Dorothy Day. We welcome you. And Your Eminence, I believe you're first. Yes.
Thank you, Paige, and it's an honor to be here with Margaret and Tom. Thank you very much. Paige, this was described as a conversation, so you just want me to chat about my love for Dorothy? I'd be honored to, all right? First, can I say how delighted I am to be with you? I think in my 9 years as Archbishop of New York, I've been able to make most of the encounters, and I've come to consider them highlights. This is a good time for me to let you know, those of you who are involved in communion and liberation, how much I admire and how much I appreciate your charism, and how delighted I am to detect such a strong presence here in the Archdiocese of New York. So thank you very much. Let me just begin with a little anecdote. When Pope Francis came, it was September of 2015, remember? And when Pope Francis came, you remember the day before he came to New York, he spoke to Congress. And if you might remember, it's the first time a pope has ever done that, you might remember that he held up 4 Americans who he thought would model the gospel. 2 of them happened to be from New York, Thomas Merton and Dorothy Day, all right? Now, when he came to New York, after his opening visit, his first stop was St. Patrick's Cathedral, appropriately, And so when we were getting back into the car for him to go home, and I was squeezed into that tiny Fiat with my knees in my mouth in the back seat, I said, you know, Holy Father, we were so grateful that you mentioned 4 towering Americans, and 2 of them were New Yorkers. And I said, I don't know if you would know, but the cause of Dorothy Day is alive. Now, when I say the cause, I mean for her eventually to become a saint. And he said, yes, I am aware of that. And I said, well, would you be embarrassed if tomorrow night at the Mass at Madison Square Garden, I would ask you publicly to declare her venerable? All right? Which, you know, he could easily do. And he said to me, I would like to do that. But he said, would you allow me to first consult with the Curia? I said, well, when did you start doing that? But anyway, I'll be darned, the next morning when I went to pick him up at the at the residence of the nuncio to the United Nations where he was residing, he called me in. He was sitting by himself in a little room with a glass of tea, and he said, I did consult. And he said, you know, it still is, he said, I was told it is still a diocesan cause and is yet to be sent to the Holy See, to the Vatican. So he said, I think it may be imprudent for me to do that. And I said, well, I trust your judgment. And now we have sent it to Rome. But then he said to me, I love her, and one day I would like to beatify her. So please God, that day will come, everybody, the beatification of Dorothy Day. You know her story, and people like Deacon Cornell would know it much better than I would. But let me mention a couple things that has always appealed to me about Dorothy. First of all would be that her very life is a sense of journey. It's a real odyssey. It's a religious odyssey and journey that would equal that of St. Augustine, that would equal that of St. Ignatius Loyola. It was constant conversion of heart that she was never finished with. Now, she reached a decisive moment in 1928 when she entered the Catholic faith, baptized down on Staten Island. But her whole life would be a conversion of heart. And you know, she lived a rather promiscuous life. She dabbled with communism and socialism and radical causes in streets not very far from here. She carried a child out of wedlock, and her husband, or not husband, but her partner at the time insisted that she abort the baby, which she did, to her lifelong regret and sense of contrition. And then, of course, gradually, she became convinced of the wisdom of the Catholic faith. So that's number one, her always conversion, always on the move, always a journey that is never over. Dorothy couldn't read enough books. She couldn't talk to enough people. She couldn't listen to enough viewpoints. She was always learning. She was always open. And that's number one, lifelong conversion. Secondly is this. You and I usually think of her as a great social activist. And indeed she was, okay, and teaches us a lot. First and foremost, she would be a disciple of Jesus Christ. And her interior faith and piety were extraordinarily important to her. Tom, when I was Archbishop of Milwaukee, I visited the Catholic Worker House there. And they told me a great story. When Dorothy visited Milwaukee in 1968, now, you remember 1968, although as I look around this young audience, which by the way is another reason I enjoy coming here because of your youth, I've never seen so many strollers in my life. You have traffic jams with baby carriages, and I love that. But they told me the story in Milwaukee. Now, so 1968 was an extraordinarily tumultuous year. The assassination of Martin Luther King, the assassination of Robert Kennedy, the height of what became our defeat in Vietnam. And when Dorothy arrived in Milwaukee to visit the Catholic Worker House, of course, she always traveled by Greyhound buses, okay? So she had been traveling for like 18 hours. And when they met her at the Greyhound bus station, they said, Dorothy, you'll be so happy to learn that you're just in time to address the Peace March. We have about 30,000 people here protesting the Vietnam War. And they are excited about you addressing them. And Dorothy said, I would be honored to address them. But first, I must get to Mass. She said, I haven't been to Mass yet today, and I have to go to Mass. So they found an evening Mass at Marquette University, which, by the way, is where they house her papers in the archives. And she went to Mass and then went to the rally. I only tell you that to illustrate this second point that I mentioned has always moved me about Dorothy, okay? And that's her interior piety. She was a deeply religious woman. She would be the first to say she wasn't a saint, which is usually a good mark of one who is. But her prayer and her love of the Mass and the Holy Eucharist, her love of confession. You know, she wrote that Life of the Little Flower, didn't she, Tom? She said it was her worst book. I don't think it was, but to show we usually think of her, you know, on the front lines of protest, and indeed she was, and how much we admire her for that. But she was a remarkably spiritual woman, and her faith gave rise to what she did. And finally, I may come back, Paige, I don't know, but finally, the third point that has always fascinated me about Dorothy would be her kind of holistic approach to things. Once again, you've got the spiritual, all right, her conversion of heart and her intimacy with Jesus in and through prayer and the sacraments. Number two would be her insistence upon teaching and learning. So you must remember that with the Catholic Worker, this is a way for her to teach, all right, and she depended upon Peter Maurin for that, his Christian personalism that would be made famous in our day through Pope St. John Paul II. But the teaching, remember, Tom, you would, during the Depression, when the homeless and unemployed men would gather at Union Square around the barrels, the fire, to warm themselves. And Dorothy would hold little classes to teach them, all right? Mostly the social justice teachings of the church. Number three, her houses of hospitality, okay? We have one here in the Archdiocese of New York, I'm honored to say. These are places sort of like Christian flop houses where anybody is welcome, where you can get a cup of coffee and a bowl of soup anytime, where there's always company and camaraderie, where you're free to stay one night, 2 nights, the rest of your life, where there's some sense of community and prayer and communal vision. These are the houses of hospitality. And finally would be, so we're talking about this holistic, coherent approach of Dorothy, finally would be her farms. There aren't many left. Tom lives on one of them. But in many ways, and I guess, Tom, it was due to Peter Maurin, she kind of was an agrarian anarchist. Now, when we say anarchist, we usually mean bomb throwers. I'm speaking of an anarchist philosophically, that if people, Peter Maurin, if people could get back to the land, we're talking about people like Chesterton and Eric Gill, we're talking about people like Thomas Jefferson. If people could get back to the land, and if they could plant, and if they could live, and if they could cultivate the land and live in community, and if people from the cities could come there and live, they would be spiritually, physically, and economically refreshed. I'd have to say, Tom, with some examples, the farms didn't work too well, did they? You might have some, I hope you, I'd love it if you're able to contradict me, but
I will.
She envisioned a chain of them throughout the country, and not many of them have persevered, but the idea is magnificent, and the ones that have persevered are brilliant. So that, if you'll let me, Paige, those 3 points are kind of at the core of my esteem for Dorothy Day. Thank you.
Dorothy could, well, I will contradict you on the farms.
Dorothy would be proud.
That was the third plank of Peter Morin's program, the agrarian universities of the farms, communal farms, was the weakest throughout the first and second periods of the Catholic worker movement. But we found a revival. Now that people are more aware of the threat to the ecology, to the biosphere, to the land and air and the water, we have a burst of new energy in the Catholic worker in our farms across the country. I forget how many there are. There are not very many of them, but they're really quite active and optimistic and fruitful. I don't know. I don't know. I think I'd like to start by telling a little story about Dorothy that shows something of the way she viewed the world.
Did you know her, Tom?
I knew her quite well. I was her editor from 1962 to 1964. The first job she gave me was managing editor of the Catholic Worker paper.
That never made money.
But I was deeply involved in the peace movement with A.J. Musty, whom she deeply admired, whose name is probably unknown by most people here. But he was the most prominent pacifist of the 20th century, and the link between the labor movement, the religious community, and the academy. He trained many of the principal labor leaders in the United States. Martin Luther King could not raise the money to organize the 1963 March on Washington. I know who organized it, Bayard Rustin, how he did it. He got on the phone to Walter and Victor Reuther of the Auto Workers Union. I know how Cesar Chavez financed his campaigns. Again, Walter and Victor Reuther, who were trained by A.J. Musty. But let me get down to more mundane things. A lady came in with a contribution, a diamond ring. What are we going to do with a diamond ring? Well, Catherine came in, and she was a dreadful woman, frankly. She was very demanding. We paid her rent. We gave her the food that she required for her and her crippled son. And she always wanted more and more and more. And Dorothy gave her the diamond ring. And the people around her said, "What did you do that for? You could have taken that ring to the diamond exchange, gotten enough money to pay several months' rent, maybe more than a year. You could buy food, you could buy this, that, the other thing." And Dorothy said, "Do you suppose that God created diamonds only for rich people? Let her do what she wants with it. She can sell it herself or she can keep it and simply admire it." That was Dorothy. I first met her, attracted to the Catholic worker, by reading The Long Loneliness, which was published in 1952. It's hot off the presses. I was so taken with Dorothy. She was living such an adventuresome life. She was hobnobbing, socializing with, working with the primary literary people of the day, and she was 19 and 20 years old. I was 19 and 20 years old, and what was I doing? I was a freshman at Fairfield University studying English literature, and Dorothy was helping to make it. Well, I had to meet her. The story of the life on the Bowery, all that stuff. I met some people who had met at the Catholic worker and married there. They were now a middle-aged couple with 11 kids. And we studied together. We would read Peter Morin's essays. We would read the classics, Tawney, and I told him how much I wanted to go down to the Bowery and check it out. Well, I was almost 5'11", weighing 115 pounds. I was frail, you might even say delicate. And they said, "Don't worry, Tom, if you can't take it, I mean, it's not for everybody. Don't worry, if it's too much for you, just come home." Well, I went down, walked down Bowery, 3rd Avenue, south of 14th Street. The 3rd Avenue elevated train was still running, and it caused quite a clamor, of course, and grit and grimy stuff, and falling down and rising up from the street, and the traffic weaving in and out of the pillars that held the subway tracks up, and the people, hundreds, thousands of people milling around, many of them obviously substance affected in some way. Many of them sitting on the sidewalk, their backs to the wall, some sprawled out. And the odor was a mixture of everything that comes out of the human body, changing a little bit every yard or so. And the smell of rotting lungs, a smell I knew only too well. My father had died of tuberculosis, and I had nursed him. I got around to the Catholic Worker, a block east of the Bowery, Christie Street. Entered, the Friday night meeting was already commenced. All the seats were taken, people were standing by the wall, some were sitting on the floor. I stood, and I saw a lady in that corner. She was on the floor knitting, and her needles clattered when she didn't like what she heard.
She's smoking?
No. She was waiting for I don't remember who the speaker was. I don't remember what the topic was. But there was a question and answer period afterwards, and somebody got up and said, "We're Catholic Christians. We all believe in the right to life. If you believe in the right to life, you must believe in the right to the means of life. The means of life to life are food, clothing, shelter, health care." Well, that's a question that's still being debated in the United States today. But it was beyond debate at the Catholic Worker even at that time. I'm talking about 1953. But Dorothy put her needles down and she stood up. She said, "You're talking about security. People should have security that their needs will be met. I don't want to hear about security anymore. There are young people here tonight, and they don't need to hear about security. There are great things that need to be done, and who will do them but the young? The young have open, generous hearts, and they yearn for adventure. How will they do the great things that need to be done if all they're thinking about is their own security?" And then she started stringing the Bible quotes together. "Consider not the morrow. The morrow can take care of itself. Don't be concerned about what you're going to eat or what you're going to put on. Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. Not Solomon in all his glory was arrayed as one of these. Your Father has care of you." Then she ended with, "Unless the seed fall into the ground and die, it remains alone. But if the seed falls to the ground and dies, it bears a great harvest." By then I knew she had me. Well, I didn't know how I was going to serve the Catholic Worker movement, but I stayed in school, even though I wanted to quit right away. I wanted to be of some use. So I got to know the people, leaders in the peace movement, and I found that as a representative of the Catholic Worker movement, I had easy access to the leadership of all the rest of the peace movement. And pretty soon, I got to know everybody, and they knew me. I wanted to do great things. So, after spending 3 years teaching public high school in order to gain credentials, so at last I could marry and support a family, I resigned as soon as I had permanent certification and went to the Worker to do great things. And what did I find I was doing? Peeling potatoes, scraping carrots, serving soup, giving men a change of clothing in our clothing room, taking them to the flop houses at night, and paying them in. But in the interstices, we did accomplish some great things because of Dorothy's encouragement. We helped to dismantle the legal structures of racial segregation in this country. We weren't the leaders. It was not for us. But when the black people called us, we answered, we came. I was a marshal at Selma. That was a high point in my career. And when I talk to high school or college students about it, I sometimes burst into tears, even when I'm alone at my typewriter, recalling those days and writing. I find the tears pouring down my face and my throat choked. We now know that we held the Pentagon's hands from nuclear war. The Pentagon urged President Lyndon Johnson to use nuclear weapons on North Vietnam at least 3 times, and he refused, pointing out the window in the White House to us across the street. He couldn't get away with it. And another great thing that we did was because we adhered closely to the classical theory and practice of nonviolence consistently, we helped with the civil rights movement to reintroduce the theory and practice of nonviolence into the mainstream of both Catholic and Protestant moral theology. Up to this time, it had been relegated to groups like the Quakers, the Mennonites, Anabaptists, and God bless them, they've taught us a great deal. But it was smaller, so-called fringe groups. And now, because of the civil rights movement and because we in the Vietnam movement adhered, at least the religious pacifists did, to classical nonviolence, it's become a serious study once again. And this is borne out by Pope Francis' peace message this year for Peace Day, and by his November 10th statement that the possession, the maintenance and possession of nuclear weapons is now morally unjustifiable. Unjustifiable. What does that mean? Catholic people should know this, and they should know what is the logical consequence. We should be working for a series of unilateral initiatives for nuclear disarmament. That should be a religious duty laid upon every Catholic Christian from the pulpit. When Dorothy died, Isadora Feinstein Stone, I.F. Stone, or Izzy, came to her funeral from Washington, D.C. He was an independent journalist. He'd never made much money in his life. He was a minimally observant Jew. And why does he come up in his old age and his poverty by bus to Dorothy's funeral? One of the guys asked him after the funeral mass in the office, and Izzy said, "Of all the journalists of our generation, she wrote the best." And I want to read this to you, the postscript from The Long Loneliness. We were just sitting there talking when Peter Morin came in. We were just sitting there talking when lines of people began to form saying, "We need bread." We could not say, "Go, be thou filled." If there were 6 small loaves and a few fishes, we had to divide them. There was always bread. We were just sitting there talking, and people moved in on us. Let those who can take it, take it. Some moved out, and that made room for more. And somehow, the walls expanded. We were just sitting there talking, and someone said, "Let's all go live on a farm." It was as casual as all that, I often think. It just came about. It just happened. I found myself a barren woman, the joyful mother of children. It is not easy always to be joyful, to keep in mind the duty of delight. The most significant thing about the Catholic worker is poverty, some say. The most significant thing is community, others say. We are not alone anymore. But the final word is love. At times it has been, in the words of Father Zosima, a harsh and dreadful thing, and our very faith and love has been tried through fire. We cannot love God unless we love each other, and to love, we must know each other. We know Him in the breaking of bread, and we know each other in the breaking of bread, and we are not alone anymore. Heaven is a banquet, and life is a banquet too, even with a crust where there is community. We have all known the long loneliness, and we have learned that the only solution is love, and that love comes with community. It all happened while we sat there talking, and it is still going on. She wrote that when the worker was only 18 or 19 years old. We're 85 now, on the brink of it, and it's still going on. Dorothy taught, along with Peter, the primacy of the spiritual. Everything she did began in prayer, was sustained by prayer, and came to fulfillment in prayer. Without a strenuous, disciplined prayer life, you cannot do this kind of thing. The poor resent those who help them. It often happens, you find this out. And yet, it's renewed time after time after time. And somehow or other, we stay young. I'm so glad there are so many young people here today. It's the most startling thing. When I go to a meeting as large as this, I expect to see a sea of shining pates, white and blue hair. It's so good to see you. So glad to have you, Cardinal Dolan. We're so grateful to you for all you've done for the cause of Dorothy Day. And Margaret, grateful to you for all you've done in that absolutely marvelous exhibit up on the 5th floor. And I want to thank all of the communion and liberation people who have made such a marvelous adventure, such a success of this event. Thank you very much, and God bless you.
Well done. Thank you.
I was so struck listening to Tom read the postscript of the long loneliness. We have that as the last panel of our exhibit upstairs, and I wanted it there. I find it so impressive. It also speaks of the journey, of a piece of the journey at least, that the Cardinal was speaking of. So as Paige said, I, along with some friends, curated an exhibit that's upstairs about Dorothy Day. And I wanted to start by just saying a bit about this exhibit, how it came to be. Actually, last year at this encounter, one of the speakers on this stage brought up Dorothy Day. It was actually David Brooks, the New York Times columnist. He said that in a class that he teaches at Yale, he assigns the students a number of different books in the semester, and then they have a final paper to write at the end of the semester, and far and away, the person that the students want to write about is Dorothy Day. And I also read The Long Loneliness in college and was fascinated by Dorothy Day. So it was also beautiful for me to hear that that's how Tom first encountered Dorothy Day, through that book. I also came to know about Dorothy Day in my childhood. My parents, who are also here, were inspired by her, and she was kind of a figure in the ethos, the backdrop of our upbringing, the sense of hospitality to the poor, simplicity of life. And when I heard her brought up again last year, I thought, I want to get to know her more. I felt like she was someone that, like an old friend who I kind of got to know but then lost track of over the years. And I also thought it would be beautiful for her to be here. This was her city, and she has a lot to say to us. I thought she has a lot to say to me, and she has a lot to say to all of us. So in conversation with some friends, and then in light especially of this year's theme, an impossible unity, we thought that really she was just right for this year. Hers was a complex life, full of tensions, apparent contradictions. Her activism, that was part of her youth, she was an activist from her youth, it persisted through her life, as we've already heard about, but became so deeply rooted in her life of prayer, of the sacraments. I mean, my experience as an American Catholic is sometimes to see some Catholics who are very committed to the cause of justice, some who love the liturgy, and for her it's clear that they're of a piece, as we've already heard a little bit about. We kind of followed Cardinal Dolan, something he said about her actually in putting the exhibit together. He said, she's a saint for our times because she shows us what's best in Catholic life, the capacity to be both and, not either or. So that's why we called the exhibit a Catholic paradox. I want to share with you 3 points of unity in Dorothy's life that have made a big impression on me. There's so much. I never met her as Tom did or lived with her, but just getting to know her through her writings and through the Catholic worker movement, just a little bit of encounter with the Catholic worker movement. There's so much that could be shared, but I want to share about 3 things. First, her friendship with Peter Morin, who was the co-founder of the Catholic Worker. Second, her solidarity and unity with the poor. And third, her affection for St. Therese. Actually, Cardinal Dolan mentioned that she wrote a biography of St. Therese, the Little Flower. So first, Peter Morin. Peter Morin gave Dorothy the inspiration for the Catholic Worker. She said, he is most truly the founder of the Catholic Worker movement. His entrance into her life came as a... Peter Morin, yeah. His entrance into her life came as a total surprise, really, and an answer to fervent prayer. So in 1932, she had already been a Catholic for several years, and she said she didn't know one Catholic layman. She knew priests and religious, but she didn't know any Catholic layman. And she was working for Commonweal, and she was covering a hunger march in Washington, D.C. that was organized by the Communist Party. And she felt a division. She wanted to be in solidarity with the workers, but she felt a sense of distance. She hadn't yet discovered a way to live her Christian life in a way that put her in the kind of unity and solidarity with the workers and with the poor that she so deeply desired. And she recounts in The Long Loneliness how she went to pray at the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception, on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, for unity, a synthesis, unity of life. And upon her return, she said when she came back to New York, Peter Morin came to her door. And he showed up at her house. It's incredible the way she describes this. He showed up at her house telling her that an editor at Commonweal and a communist, a red-headed communist that he met at Union Square, both told him that he should meet her, that they think alike. And he had a program. He had a program. She said, I was good at criticizing the social order, but I didn't have a positive vision, and Peter gave her this vision, starting a newspaper and having roundtable discussions for the clarification of thought, opening houses of hospitality, and returning to the land, living on farms like the one that Tom lives on. The beautiful thing is, one of the beautiful things about this for me is how much their meeting was this unforeseen event, but really the response to this need that she had. It wasn't a likely friendship. Peter Morin was an unusual man. In The Loaves and Fishes, the story of the Catholic Worker, she says this, I was sure of Peter, sure he was a saint and a great teacher, although, to be perfectly honest, I wondered if I really liked Peter sometimes. He was 20 years older than I. He spoke with an accent so thick it was hard to penetrate to the thought beneath. He had a one-track mind. Apparently, he would just talk and talk, Peter, And he would indoctrinate, she said. He wanted to indoctrinate people. He didn't like music, which she loved. He didn't read Dickens or Dostoevsky, also which she loved. And he did not bathe. She's very honest in her writing. I am sensitive about writing these things, she says, but I feel I must point out that it was no natural liking that made me hold Peter in reverent esteem and gave me confidence that all I learned from him was sound and that the program he laid down for us was the right one for our time. I think just their friendship speaks of this impossible unity. She, this fierce, independent, able American woman who follows this older Frenchman who many might dismiss. Many of the things that he did might seem kind of crazy, unusual. But I think her acute awareness of her own longing and need made her so open to Peter and able to recognize his genius. He really educated her a lot in the faith, showed her the link between the finite and the infinite, between her Christian faith and her passion for justice. And he would say to her, and I guess to others too, she quotes him as saying this frequently, when something seemed to be a failure, like one of the farms maybe didn't work out or things didn't seem to be going very well, he would say, at least it will arouse the conscience. At least it will arouse the conscience. It wasn't about sort of success according to our standards. Very much like Peter, Dorothy lived a kind of solidarity with the poor that's rare, that Tom lives and knows very much about, but living not just for the poor, but with the poor, living a radical, very concrete poverty. But one of the things that really strikes me about her way of living in solidarity with the poor was that there was nothing generic about it, that the poor were particular people. She said, there's so much more to the Catholic worker movement than labor and capital. It is the people who are important, not the masses. She said she almost wished she had named their publication The People instead of The Catholic Worker at one point. I can't imagine how many people she encountered, how many destitute and poor people, mentally ill and addicted people, how many people in turmoil. But the way she writes about particular people is very striking. There's a chapter in her book, Loaves and Fishes, called Whatever Happened to Anna. And she describes Anna, a short, shuffling woman with a broad, flat face, a big, smiling mouth, and little tufts of hair growing out of her chin. Usually she wore several dresses and several coats. Anna's vanity showed only in her style of headdress. She always wore winding, strange pieces of silk of many colors around her head in fantastic turbans. She smiled continually. Her two favorite topics of conversation were marriage and the benign spirits that surrounded her. Anna was someone who probably many people would pretty quickly dismiss. And she was also a woman who didn't readily receive hospitality. And this is what most strikes me about this whole episode, and I think something that really marks the charism of the Catholic worker, is the way they received Anna in a way that she could receive it. So Dorothy described how they invited her to stay with them. First she wouldn't, then she said, okay, I'll stay, but I won't take a bed. I haven't slept in a bed in 30 years. So she slept in the hallway on the floor. Dorothy said when she tried to put a blanket on her, she pushed it away. She wouldn't take it. But if they left a blanket nearby, she would go and pick it up. And Dorothy said, in this way, she stayed with us. Anna's freedom, her own way, her unique way, was respected. Dorothy said, our aim is to make people happy. We certainly succeeded with Anna in the end, but it took years before she made herself at home with us. I'm a psychologist. I work as a therapist, and even though this episode might seem very far from my work, for me it's very provoking because the way of each person is distinct, And when I read something like this, I think I want to receive someone with that kind of patience and that kind of attention and the willingness to wait and receive them in a way that they can be received. In the context of the Catholic worker, there have always been many tasks to be done, right? The writing of newspaper articles, peeling potatoes and carrots, as Tom said, cooking meals, serving soup. In preparation for this exhibit, a few friends and I who were preparing it visited Pat and Kathleen Jordan, who met at the Catholic worker, and they recounted us some beautiful episodes about Dorothy Day. And one really struck me. Pat said that Dorothy would always look for a place for people, a task that they could do, some way to plug them in. And then he said to her, she said to him, don't be too efficient. Don't be too efficient. It really struck me, like, don't allow getting things done to interfere with attending to each person. And I imagine many poor people, many people who haven't had a lot of opportunities might need more time to learn how to do something or to plug in and find a place. Certainly Dorothy couldn't have kept track of all the people that she met over the years, but what's clear when she recounts a story about someone like Anna is that she perceived their belonging to each other. You know, that for her, she and Anna were both part of the mystical body of Christ. They were sisters. And now that I'm getting to know Dorothy better, I can't get away from this. I mean, I see someone standing on the street corner, and I'm provoked. I think reading her helps me to start to see people more through her eyes, you know, which I think is through the eyes of Christ. Finally, I wanted to say a little bit about the affection that she developed for Saint Therese of Lisieux. I think that this also speaks about the journey that she was on, that Cardinal Dolan spoke about, because even after her conversion, she didn't appreciate Saint Therese initially. In fact, when she was first given her story of a soul to read by Father Zachary, her confessor at the time, she was offended. She said, this is what she wrote about it. She was very young, Saint Therese, was very young, and her writing seemed to me like that of a schoolgirl. I wasn't looking for anything so simple and felt slightly aggrieved at Father Zachary. Men, and priests too, were very insulting to women, I thought, handing out what they felt suited their intelligence. In other words, pious pap. So this was her first impression of Saint Therese. She wrote about this in the preface to the biography. She said, she couldn't see what Therese had to do with living, quote, in a time of world revolution amidst world conflict. You know, she was more attracted to Joan of Arc, Teresa of Avila. But I think the way that she grew an affection for Therese, to the point that she wanted to write a biography of her, speaks also of the change in Dorothy and the recognition in Dorothy of what really was at the heart of all of her activism. You know, how different the lives of these two women. Therese dying at 24 of tuberculosis, very Catholic upbringing, you know, protected in so many ways from so much of what Dorothy went through. Experiences of poverty herself, tumultuous love affairs, an abortion, meeting many, many people. After her conversion, traveling around tremendously on buses, being jailed multiple times for civil disobedience. But Dorothy recognized that it's not our actions that make our lives great. A woman who acted so much, right? And I think coming to love Therese and the affection that she had for her really expresses this, right? What was at the heart of the matter for both of them was a love that didn't come from them, a cruciform love. In her diary in 1944, Dorothy wrote this about Therese. From that year, I spent away from the work. There was a time where she spent, not a whole year, but some time away from the Catholic worker. I began to understand the greatness of the little flower, Saint Therese of Lisieux. By doing nothing, she did everything. She let loose powers, consolations, a stream of faith, hope, and love that will never cease to flow. How much richer we are because of her. And I think, like Therese, how much richer we are because of Dorothy. And for me, it's very striking because I think the same thing that bound Therese to Dorothy binds me to her. You know, I haven't been called to the Catholic worker. I'm not in a cloister. But that I want for the heart of my life to be the same thing that was at the heart of the lives of these two beautiful women. So that's it. If any of you are more interested, we have this exhibit upstairs. So come and see if you want to learn more about her. Thank you.
Way to go, Margaret.
At this time, I am very happy to introduce to you our two grand prize winners of the third New York Encounter School Contest. This year's students in Catholic schools from the Archdiocese of New York, the Archdiocese of Newark, and the Diocese of Brooklyn were invited to participate in the contest, which exists as a way to further celebrate the gift of education as the path to a more human discovery of reality. And you can see the work of the winners, as well as all those who submitted to the contest, up on the 5th floor. It's in front of the Abraham exhibit that was made for children, and also very close to the Dorothy Day exhibit as well. So I encourage you to go take a look and certainly visit the Dorothy Day exhibit. Students were asked for the contest to submit a drawing or essay responding to the contest question related to this year's special children's exhibit called Abraham's Tent, All Are Welcome. The contest question was, how does Abraham help us to know what it means to be a father? The contest is sponsored by Benedictine College, and we are very grateful for their support. The grand prize is a $1,000 tuition scholarship for use at the Winners Catholic School for the current school year. The grand prize is awarded for 2 grade bands, grades 1 through 5 and grades 6 through 8. So our first grand prize winner for grades 1 through 5 is Aliana Vasquez. Aliana, you can come up. She is a 4th grader at St. Peter's School in Belleville, New Jersey, in the Archdiocese of Newark. So congratulations on that. And the grand prize winner for grades 6 through 8 is Emily Gotianco. She is an 8th grader at St. Christopher's School in Staten Island, New York, in the Archdiocese of New York. So Emily, if you want to come up. So congratulations, and thank you very much.